for people who like to talk down on the life cycle funds, I think they're a great place to start. You can't really go wrong with them. Like I said, it's not going to start drifting toward adding more bonds until 2042. So between now, when you're listening to this episode, and 2042, you have plenty of time to go do your own reading, your own research, and develop your own asset allocation. And so that's why I encourage people to start with a life cycle. If you don't know what you're doing, if you don't know what an asset allocation is, just start with a life cycle fund. The professionals have put this together. It's a great place to put your money. And then over the next couple of years, do your own research and figure out what you want to do. And after doing your own research, if you decide I'm going to have 100% in the C fund, great. But don't just do that because some guy on the internet told you to.
Welcome to the Military Money Manual Podcast, where every episode is all about achieving financial independence in the military faster than before. We believe personal finance shouldn't be boring or intimidating. Building wealth can be simple, and financial freedom is the ultimate financial goal. Now, here's your hosts, Spencer and Jamie.
Hey there, podcast listeners. It's Jamie and Spencer Reese from the militarymoneymanual.com here with another episode. Today, we're going to talk about the Thrift Savings Plan, the TSP, and its newest fund, the L2070 fund. This is an exciting update here in late July 2024 that we wanted to share with you. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what is a lifecycle fund, what the L2070 is, and who it might be applicable for, or who might be automatically enrolled in contributing to this fund. Spencer, where we want to start? What is a lifecycle fund?
Yeah, a life cycle fund is very similar. In fact, it's basically the same thing as a target date retirement fund. And you'll hear that mentioned in civilian accounts, but in the TSP, in the Thrift Savings Plan, they're known as life cycle funds. And so what they do is they take the 5 TSP funds, so that's the G, F, C, S, and I. So that's the government bond fund, the fixed income or corporate bond fund, the S&P 500 fund, the C fund, the S fund is the small cap, the Dow Completion Index. So it's all the US stocks that aren't in the S&P 500. And then the I fund is the international stocks. And so it takes all of those funds and it blends them and gives you a risk-adjusted portfolio based on your retirement age. And so what does that mean? Well, it's going to be extremely heavy on equities or stocks early in your investing career. And then as you approach military retirement, or after you've been invested in the fund for about 18 to 20 years, it starts slowly transitioning to add more bonds to the portfolio. And the reason for this is because the government or people who build the target date retirement funds, they don't want you to get to retirement and have a 2008 or a 2020 COVID crash happen and you have a quarter or half of your retirement savings wiped out just as you're about to retire. There's arguments both ways whether that's a good investment strategy, but that's kind of what the consensus in the financial planning industry is, that as you get older, you should add more bonds to your portfolio to smooth out the fluctuations in the stock market and in your investment returns.
For the listeners that are confused about this TSP, you just mentioned 5 different funds, target date retirement accounts. There's all kinds of confusing things out there that might be new for people. So one big takeaway here is that if you decide to buy into the L2070 fund in your TSP, it does a lot of that risk balancing throughout your career or your aging process for you. And that's a balance between international stocks and US stocks and the bonds like Spencer talked about. You can also choose to do that yourself. And the second big takeaway is that if you want to learn more about the TSP, Spencer and I wrote a course. We designed a course and recorded a bunch of videos about that. So before we get any further, Spencer, can you just give us a recap on that course and what kind of things people can learn in there? And then we even have a special promo code for our listeners this year.
Yeah. So the promo code is podcast24. It's at militarymoneymanual.com/TSP. It's called the Confident TSP Investing Course. And it's basically everything Jamie and I know about the TSP, simplified. It's in a couple of videos. It's super short, but it's packed with knowledge. And we've had a lot of good feedback on it so far. And we give away every time an officer or a NCO or senior NCO buys a copy, we give a free copy to someone E4 and below. And if you are E4 and below and you want a free copy of the course, you can email tsp@militarymoneymanual.com and we'll be happy to give you a promo code so that you can get a free copy of the course.
Yeah, that's a really good, helped a lot of people so far, a really good option for those looking to learn more about the TSP. And speaking of your options in the TSP, this new L2070 fund, it's a balance of the 5 core funds that Spencer mentioned earlier, G, F, C, S, and I. And so right now, if you were to buy into the L2070 fund or to contribute to that fund in your TSP, the breakdown that you're going to get in there is 51.5% C, about 13% S, about 35% I, and then less than 1% each of G and F. And it stays that way until about 2043, which is the model that all of the target date or the lifecycle funds under the TSP have mirrored about. So if you were looking at L2065, it would start to move into a more quote unquote conservative model with less equity, more bonds at about that same time point in perspective. Any thoughts on that mix, CSI, F, and G that the 2070 has for us?
Yeah, I think it's a really solid mix. One of the complaints people had about lifecycle funds a couple of years ago was that they were overly conservative. So they added bonds way too early. And that's been completely fixed since the L2065, the L2070 fund. So less than 1% in bonds for the first 18. So if you start investing in 2025, you're not going to have more than 1% of your portfolio in bonds for 18 years. I think that makes a lot of sense. You want to take your risk early as an investor. And then it's got a good mix of international in there. So it's got 35% of the I fund represented in there. And the new I fund that's coming out this year is going to have a much better representation of the total global market, excluding China, excluding Hong Kong, and excluding the US. And so I think the I fund is going to be a great option for people to invest in their TSP over the next couple of years. And then it's got that classic 4-to-1 ratio of C to S fund. And so you'll see that. That's what I recommend if you want to build a VTI, Vanguard Total Stock Market Index Fund. Also, the Admiral Mutual Fund identifier is VTSAX. And that's because that the S&P 500 is 4 times the market capitalization of the S fund. I know I just use a lot of finance jargon there. Don't worry about it too much. Sign up for a course if you want to learn more about that. It's a pretty reasonable ratio there. And you're looking at, let's see, so that's 63% US stocks, 35% international, and then 1% bonds. That's a really reasonable portfolio, Jamie. In fact, I probably had a very similar portfolio to that over the last 10 years. You know, it starts in 2042, so 18 years into the fund, it starts drifting and adding a little bit more bonds, but you don't even get to more than 10% bonds until like 2048. So that's like 23 years after the inception of the fund. And then it's not really until 2065 that you really start ramping up that G fund. So yeah, I think this is a great place to start for an investor. The other thing is, you know, a lot of people are like anti lifecycle funds, or they're like, oh, just throw it all in the C fund. And it's like, but you're missing out on all that diversification. Like diversification is the only free lunch that we get in investing. And for people who like to talk down on the lifecycle funds, I think they're a great place to start. You can't really go wrong with them. And like I said, it's not going to start drifting toward adding more bonds until 2042. So between now, when you're listening to this episode, and 2042, you have plenty of time to go do your own reading, your own research, and develop your own asset allocation. And so that's why I encourage people to start with a lifecycle. If you don't know what you're doing, if you don't know what an asset allocation is, just start with a lifecycle fund. The professionals have put this together. It's a great place to put your money. And then over the next couple of years, do your own research and figure out what you want to do. And after doing your own research, if you decide I'm going to have 100% in the C fund, great. But don't just do that because some guy on the internet told you to. Definitely don't do those seasonal TSP investing strategies that you see on those crazy Facebook groups with the weird text. You don't need to do that either. Just throw it in a life cycle fund and ignore it. Just keep contributing, and you don't have to do anything to it. They rebalance quarterly. So if it gets out of whack, let's say the C fund grows like crazy in one quarter and the S fund doesn't, then they'll sell a little bit of the C fund and they'll buy a little bit of the S fund. And that all happens automatically behind the scenes, completely hands off. You don't have to do anything. It's automated. It's simple. In fact, it's low cost, automated, diversified, and simple. It's LADS. It's my personal investing strategy principles that I talk about in my book, The Military Money Manual. So I'm a big fan of the life cycle funds, Jamie. I think that unless you have a really good reason or you developed your own asset allocation, your own portfolio, do you really have no reason to not be in the life cycle fund?
So you talked about low cost. So the expense ratio on this is 0.054% or 5.4 basis points, which is low cost. And there are other options out there that are slightly lower than that or free. But for an employer-sponsored retirement plan like a 401k or like the TSP, that is extremely low cost. A lot of companies in their HR 401ks are offering ridiculously high fees, sometimes 2% or higher in their company's offerings. So sure, you can go find a free fund with Fidelity, but not in your TSP or usually not in your employer-sponsored retirement. This is still considered very low cost at 0.054%. So that's 54 cents per $1,000 account balance for your fee, which is very, very low. Spencer, the question that I think the audience would have is, who is this for? Is anyone eligible to choose this, or are some people automatically enrolled in this fund now? And if you could also speak to, what does the year mean? You mentioned earlier it's close to our retirement age. That means that if I'm planning on separating from the military in 2030, that I shouldn't be in the L2030 fund. So who should be kind of looking at this one potentially?
It's the 2070 fund. So it's for anybody who's planning on retiring between 2068 and 2073. So it just kind of falls in the middle of that 5-year period. And if you join the military and when you get your TSP automatically set up for you, if your birth year is 2005 or later, you're going to be automatically enrolled in the L2070 fund. If you were born between 2000 and 2004, you're going to be automatically enrolled in the L2065 fund. And then if you were born from 95 to 99 and you joined the military, you're looking at the L2060 fund. All of these funds right now are, let me just double check this, are the same asset allocation. Yep, they're the same asset allocation. So less than 1% bonds, and then 99% of the portfolio is in equities split between the US and international. So you're going to be automatically enrolled in this, and that's fine. That's great. Keep contributing, throw the money in there and let it grow. And you're going to do just fine. Now, let's say that you've been in the military for a while and God forbid you had it sitting in the G fund for the last 10 years and you're like, man, I need to get back in this and I need to make sure that my money is actually working for me in a diversified stock and bond fund. Then have a look at the L2070 fund, or you can just factor in, okay, if I'm, let's say I'm 40 years old, I'm going to retire in 25 years, then you can just add 25 to whatever the year is. So let's say it's 2025, that's 2050. You can go invest in the L2050 fund. But let's say you have a look at the L2050 fund and you're like, you know what? There's a little bit too much bonds in there. Right now, they're sitting at about 18, 19% bonds and the rest in stocks. Actually, that's a pretty reasonable portfolio. But if you can look at the glide slope and you see, okay, it's going to be adding more and more bonds and maybe you don't want that quite yet, then sure, you can invest in the L2070 fund. It's open to everyone. And the one thing that I would warn against is I see some people out there like, okay, I've got 50% of my money in the L2070 fund and I've got 50% in the C fund. And it's like, but dude, the C fund is in the L2070 fund. And if they have a good reason, they're like, no, I want to overweight US S&P 500 companies because, and then they give me their investment thesis. Then I say, okay, fine. If you have a reason, that's great. But if you don't have a reason and you're just doing it because some guy on the internet told you to, you don't have to. You can just throw it into the Lifecycle fund because it contains the 5 funds and it's been balanced by professional investment advisors to provide a risk-adjusted expected return commensurate with your age and the number of years you have until retirement.
So the big takeaway there is, I think if you're auto-enrolled for this and you don't know what to do yet, don't feel rushed to change it based on something that even 2 beautiful sounding voices on a podcast said. It gives you time and decision space to make your own decisions and do your research. Like Spencer said, there's a lot of good books out there, including his. There's a lot of good blogs out there. There's a lot of good podcasts out there. And you need to do the homework to see what fits with your personal investment strategy, your goals, when you want to retire, if you want to retire early or not, and your own risk tolerance. So there's no rush to change from L2070. And in fact, like if I were in the L2065 right now, what I would do is I would bump mine out to L2070 just because I know that I want to be more aggressive for me and my own personal strategy. So for most people, it's not a, hey, there's this new thing, you got to go click this button and enroll now. It's no action required for a vast majority of our listeners. More just awareness and education that you do have a deadline, a quasi deadline of when you might want to make a different decision, which is at that point 18 years into the fund, like we said, for late 2043 for this fund of when it starts becoming more conservative. You have up until that time to make a decision on if you want to change it or not, basically.
Yeah, and even after that time, it changes very slowly. So
yes.
it's almost never too late to
it's not
to
a cliff. Yeah,
good point. Yeah, exactly. It's not a cliff. Yeah, so lots of time. It's a great fund. I'm glad to see the TSP is staying on top of this and they're releasing new Lifecycle funds. Oh, and people might wonder, well, what happens after after 2070? The fund is rolled into what's called the L income or the Lifecycle income fund. And that just holds a lot of, I think, G fund. And it's designed to not go down in value, which is great, but it doesn't pay that much interest and the expected returns are pretty low. But like I said, you have the rest of your life to start studying and figuring out what kind of asset allocation you want. Or this would be a great opportunity to go have a conversation with a CFP, certified financial planner, fee-only fiduciary, maybe at hellonectarine.com, where they do fee-only financial advice for only $150. We had Jeremy Schneider on the podcast, and that was a great conversation with him about what he's trying to change with the financial advice industry in the United States. And you might say, look, I've got $1 million in my TSP and it's going to be all into the G, or a lot of it's moving into the G fund soon. What do you think I should do? They can probably come up with a great plan for you.
So if someone looks up on tsp.gov right now, the L2070 fund, there's a couple things I want to point out on that site. First of all, there's no average annual returns yet. If you're curious what the average annual returns would be for this new fund, you can look at the 2065 or the 2060 because the asset allocation is the same, like Spencer said. So don't freak out just because it's like an untested, unverified fund that we don't know what it's going to do. There's no risk of uncertainty of what might this fund be. Obviously, we don't know what the stock market or the world market is going to do, but it would mirror the L2060, 2065 performance over the last 1, 3, 5, or 10 years.
So the L2055 fund has the same asset allocation actually as the L2070 fund. Year to date, 10%, the 1 year return, 18.5%, and the 3 year return, 6%. So that includes the down market in 2022. But like so many things, Jamie, I mean, it's going to return what it returns. You have no control over that. The only thing you can do really is just
keep investing.
Keep buying. Just keep buying. So it's the only system that we found that works is the buy and hold, the Bogleheads investing strategy, which we'll talk about in a future episode. Get excited for that. All right, listener, thanks for bearing with us talking about the L2070 fund. We talked about what Lifecycle's funds are in the TSP. We talked in detail about the L2070 fund. And then who the fund might be good for. Well, if you just joined the military and you were born after 2005, first of all, that makes me feel very old. So thank you for that. And second of all, you're probably going to be automatically enrolled in it. And that's okay. That's a good thing because they used to automatically enroll us in the G fund and that was not good. If you got any questions, you can DM us on Instagram at Military Money Manual, or you can shoot us an email, podcast@militarymoneymanual.com, and leave us a 5-star review. Thanks. We'll catch you in the next episode of the Military Money Manual podcast.
Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of the Military Money Manual podcast. If you're enjoying the show, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. This helps others find the show, and we really appreciate it. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
The views and opinions presented here are those of the speakers and do not necessarily represent the views of the DoD or its components. Reference to any commercial products or services does not constitute DoD endorsement of those products or services.